More and more organizations have announced very ambitious renewable energy goals in the past few years. But the big question is how to achieve them. A quick answer is that you will need renewable energy certificates, aka RECs, to prove that you own electricity generated from a renewable energy resource. The most common way is to directly buy RECs that are sold, delivered, or bought separately from electricity, which is called unbundled RECs. Besides, you can produce renewable energy on-site or purchase energy from outside sources. If you're new to the renewable energy field, I would highly recommend checking out the procurement guidance our team created on the website, cityrenewables.org. In fact, renewable energy buyers can partner with multiple organizations to sign a PPA together. This is known as load aggregation. To make sure everybody's on the same page, I would like to specify that our cohort will not be focused on community solar or community choice aggregation. Instead, we're talking about how multiple buyers can sign an aggregated PPA. So renewable energy aggregation can provide several key benefits. First of all, load aggregation can help you meet your organization's renewable energy goal faster because of larger deal size. Second, the larger a PPA deal is, the lower its price will be. Also, buyers can share expenses for contract creation, negotiation, and resources such as external legal and consulting services. Some organizations are too small to enter a renewable energy PPA alone. So an aggregated deal can help those of you who would otherwise not be able to access a large-scale renewable energy transaction. In an aggregated deal, market risks can be lower or hedged because they often involve multiple projects spreading across several locations. And having multiple contract review teams can help ensure you'll get the best terms. Besides, an aggregated deal can allow partners to share expertise, build a peer network, and combine PR efforts. The entire aggregation process can be summarized as 7 steps. First, identify what kind of renewable energy deal your organization wants. Then find your procurement partners and form a group. And align on desired project details. Next, pitch to senior leaders, which is a critical go or no-go moment. Then collectively select suppliers and projects with your partners by issuing a request for a proposal. And negotiate contract terms with the selected suppliers and sign separate but similar contracts. Finally, share your success and support others who are also doing an aggregated deal. I will explain this process step by step. The very first step is a needs assessment. Here is a list of questions you should consider before pursuing an aggregated deal. For example, do I want a physical or virtual PPA? What will the timing look like? Throughout the aggregation process, you might need to pitch the deal to senior leaders at least 3 times. At this stage, you can give an initial pitch to get early internal buy-in by explaining how aggregation can help achieve your organization's climate goals, what some benefits are, and so on. I have shared the pitch deck template with you all yesterday. It is an easily modifiable template to communicate the idea of renewable aggregation within your organization. It's also necessary to review procurement options with your legal and accounting team, especially when you are doing a virtual PPA. So our team is currently finalizing some tools such as aggregation accounting primer, and virtual PPA legal consideration memo, and we'll share them with you all once they're done. The second step is to find your partners. You will need to consider several factors such as existing relationships, their procurement experience level, whether they have large local presence, and whether they can bring additional equity and inclusion benefits. When selecting partners, you should introduce your procurement needs that you identified during the last step. It will be very helpful to establish a governance structure. Although it might be time consuming, this can save a lot of time if this group will pursue any other deals together in the future. The third step is to align on desired project details within your group. There will be some key decisions to make, such as number of projects, REC ownership, cost requirements, and desired benefits. An important note is that alignment at this stage should be approached with a goal to compromise and enable participation in the deal. The more flexibility your RFP provides, the more proposed pricing options you will likely receive. Once your group decides what you all would like to include in RFP, the next step is to align on how RFP responses will be evaluated. A critical element of an RFP is the potential co-benefits of a project. And here's a list of co-benefits you can consider mentioning in your RFP. The fourth step is to pitch to senior leaders again and confirm buyers. Earlier, I mentioned there are 3 important pitches you might need to give throughout the aggregation process, and this is the second one. The goal is to get an approval from senior leaders to issue an RFP with your partners. Different from the first pitch, the second one will have more specific details like its expected financial performance and implications for future budgets. At this point, additional buyers can be added to the procurement if they agree on established RFP terms. The group may choose to update or sign a new participant agreement before issuing an RFP that outlines who's involved, how the RFP will be managed, and who will select the supplier. The fifth step is to select suppliers and projects through an RFP process. In the RFP, you can consider including your group's annual load and each buyer's hourly load profiles if possible. You will need to clearly indicate that developers will be signing a separate contract with each buyer and describe what each buyer can customize after the template contract is developed. It's also important to specify the RFP evaluation process and evaluation committee members. The next step, negotiating contracts, can take months and go through many revisions. Usually the process is to negotiate and sign term sheet, then develop template contract. Afterwards, each buyer reviews the contract and in some cases can make additional modifications. Meanwhile, there are several key risks you might want to keep in mind. For example, decreasing market prices, less electricity produced than expected, delayed construction, improper operation, and participation leading to negative impact on reputation, or projects forced to curtail to maintain grid stability, or even project owner going bankrupt. Most organizations will require final approval from senior leadership to enter the contract. Therefore, you should also update your pitch. Signing a contract doesn't mean the entire process is over. You and your partners should also work with each other and the project owner to determine how and when to announce a deal to the public, as well as who will take the lead. A very interesting example is about the city of Melbourne, Australia. After they completed the aggregated deal, the city wrote a case study about their PPAs and published their RP online as example to others. So this is a very high-level introduction to the renewable energy aggregation process. You can find more details in the aggregation procurement guide that we'll send out soon. Next, my colleague Alisa will introduce a governance structure within an aggregated deal. Thank you.
Thanks, Yunning. So Yunning covered a lot of information there at a very high level. You'll notice that a lot of those steps actually align with different meetings that we're going to cover during kind of the aggregation cohort. So if everything that she just shared feels a little overwhelming, we will dive into all of that more. And she also mentioned that we are in the process of developing an aggregation procurement guidance document that walks through each of those steps and kind of talks about them in detail. We are going to share a draft version of that document with you. It's pretty much, it's final, but it just hasn't gone through the design process. So like there will be a much happier, nicer version that we'll eventually put on our website. But it would be great for if you have any kind of follow-up questions, I think that can be a good resource for you to review, and we'll share that along with this entire slide deck, either at the end of the week or really early next week. But my section will be covering kind of a deep dive into the governance structure. Many of you have a pretty good sense for what you're looking for out of a renewable deal. Some of you have worked with the people in your procurement group before. Some of you, these people are entirely new to you. And so having these kind of governance structure conversations early on to understand what your roles and responsibilities are will be really important to have success in procuring together long term. So there are a few different governance structures that we've seen successfully implemented if you kind of look at other aggregation deals. And I think each of them kind of have their pros and their cons, and depending on your group, various structures might make sense. And I'll just say that I'm going to describe these structures in their purest form. I think there are modifications and different flavors of each of these structures that you could choose to pursue. So the first structure is anchor off-taker. What this looks like is that there is kind of one buyer that is leading this procurement deal. That might be because they are, they're procuring the largest portion of the load. It might just be because they have time and energy that they're able to put into the procurement deal. But essentially they are moving the process forward and are kind of the key decision maker. That doesn't mean that they don't listen to their other procurement partners and kind of get feedback on key decisions, but ultimately they have the decision-making power. A lot of times you choose an anchor off-taker because they're already moving forward with an RFP process, and so whether or not you kind of aggregate with them or not, they will pursue a deal. If that's the case, then an anchor off-taker model might make the most sense. There are pros to this model. One, a pro would be if you are maybe a new buyer that has never procured renewables before, or a really small buyer, and you don't have that much time to commit to kind of moving a full aggregation deal forward, or a full offsite procurement deal forward, or you feel really kind of overwhelmed by the idea of offsite procurement, partnering with an anchor off-taker that's procured before and is willing to kind of handle some of that administrative burden could make a lot of sense. Also, because there is just one person that's making the decision, the process can move forward a little bit faster because there don't need to be as many alignment conversations and kind of discussions to make sure everyone is aligned. The downside of this anchor off-taker model is that because you're not working quite as closely with all your partners, and every partner doesn't necessarily have as equal of a decision-making power, there's a pretty good chance that the deal might not be a perfect fit for every single partner. So you might be more likely to drop out of the deal because it doesn't necessarily meet your needs. If you are not kind of the anchor off-taker and you're working with an anchor off-taker, there's a good chance that you might need to be a little bit more flexible in what you're willing to pursue for an aggregated deal. And the benefit of being more flexible is you essentially get to participate in an offsite deal with fairly minimal administrative work. The next model is essentially the polar opposite of that, which is the equal off-taker model. This could mean that each buyer is taking roughly the same amount out of the procurement deal, or it could just mean that you decided to structure it where you all have equal decision-making power and every single decision needs to be aligned on by all partners. The upside of this is because you are aligning and listening to each other at every stage of the process, the odds of you ending up with a deal that you're really comfortable with and pitching to your senior leadership is probably a lot higher. The downside is it does take a lot more time to coordinate just because you do have to align and listen to various voices. And I think depending on the size of the procurement group, the larger the procurement group gets, the more difficult an equal off-taker model can be. So the kind of the final flavor of governance structure is a tiered off-taker approach. So I mentioned that when a group gets really big, sometimes it can feel a little unwieldy. And so some groups have decided to kind of do this tiered approach where they have kind of the key decision makers, and then there's kind of the second tier that they're more of like an opt-in, opt-out partner. So they don't have as much say in the deal. They just get to decide whether they want to participate or if the deal doesn't really meet their needs. The upside to this type of procurement structure is that you might be able to have a little bit more flexibility and be able to move a little bit quicker if you have 2 or 3 decision makers versus 10, just because 2 or 3 it's easier to align on a deal. The downside of this is that there is a lot of communication and coordination that's needed, both between kind of like the first tier and the second tier participants, and making sure that there's still kind of the chance that those second tier participants might drop out because the deal doesn't meet their needs. And so there's just a lot of coordination associated with this tiered off-taker model. In addition to kind of figuring out who the decision makers are and kind of that like high level framing of governance structure, there are some additional things that you're going to need to discuss as a group to make sure that you feel like you have a good sense for how your procurement group can move forward. So the first thing is, who will be your facilitator or project manager? Now this could be the anchor off-taker, or it could be a completely different person. So like for instance, in the DVRPC group, they're not necessarily taking any of the renewables themselves, but they are facilitating the conversation. So that would be the facilitator for that group. The next thing would be thinking about meeting schedules and communication norms. So you know that if you're participating in this cohort, we're going to be meeting monthly for 90 minutes, but it's likely that you won't be able to cover everything within these small little breakout groups. So they're talking about whether you need to have additional meetings outside of this aggregation group as a procurement group, and when those meetings need to occur and kind of how to organize them around key deadlines will be another topic of conversation that eventually you'll need to align. Who will be responsible for decision making? We talked about that a lot kind of in the like high level framing of governance structures, but I think another kind of added layer to that is there might be some decisions that the full group needs to buy in on, and there might be some decisions that only a few partners need to buy in on. So figuring out which decisions require like full group alignment or full group consensus, and which decisions are maybe more majority consensus will be important as Figuring out what your deadlines are for pitching this to senior leadership. This is particularly important if you are maybe playing more of a, I don't want to say observer role, but if you're not as actively planning to participate in shaping the procurement deal, really understanding when you need to have when you need to pitch this to your decision maker and what kind of needs to be in place in order to be able to make that pitch will be really important to kind of align on early on as well. And then figuring out who's issuing the RFP, who's reviewing the RFP responses after they're issued, and finally who gets to decide and actually select that renewable developer. And if you maybe don't feel comfortable reviewing issuing an RFP or reviewing an RFP response, there's also another conversation around, do we need to bring in some external consultants? And if we are bringing in external consultants, how are we paying for those? Are we sharing the cost? What does that cost sharing structure look like? So those are some conversations that will need to be had. We're going to give some time during the small group time to start having some of these conversations, but obviously these are long conversations that you probably won't be able to come to a decision on in the 30 minutes that we're giving you during small group time. So these are just important to kind of keep in the back of your mind and eventually get to a consensus on as a procurement. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Mia to actually walk through 3 different case studies of different aggregated procurements using different governance structures.
Thanks, Elisa. And can you advance the slide? Great, thank you. So the first case study I'm going to talk about fits the anchor off-taker model. And this was a deal done with Apple, Swiss Renewables, Etsy, and Akamai. For this deal, Apple acted as the anchor off-taker and they procured the majority of output from both projects. And actually, because this group was so large, they procured from both a wind farm and a solar facility. Akamai did join Apple in both deals as a smaller off-taker, but what makes this really unique is that Etsy and Swiss were able to join in one individual procurement, each of them, getting less than 5% of the output from the facility, yet still getting the contract terms and prices of Apple. And so by joining as a procurement group, these smaller off-takers were able to get all of the benefits that Apple was getting, whereas Apple was able to really lead as an entity that has experience with these types of procurements and a much larger load. Elisa, will you go to the next slide? Great, thank you. This is also another corporate example, although it fits an equal off-taker model. For this, the 5 companies who are working together knew they wanted to do a virtual power purchase agreement and decided very early on the general broad strokes of the deal they wanted to pursue. And when doing so, they decided that they each wanted to buy a similar amount of output, 5 to 10 megawatts each, while splitting all costs equally and using a blended credit rating, ensuring that they were all getting the same financing and terms. As a group, they didn't actually purchase all of the output from the facility. And so while internally they acted as equal off-takers, in the larger group, they actually acted as an anchor for the project to secure financing. Can we go to the next slide, Elisa? Thank you. And for the last example is with this tiered model, looking in from Melbourne, Australia, where 14 groups, including 4 city governments, got together on one renewable deal. And they opted for a tiered model in order to allow participation of more buyers. And so while 14 members went in on this procurement, it was a smaller group of 6 that made core decisions and really led on the procurement, while they also had an advisory group and constant communication with the rest of the members. This procurement group also decided to codify their participation with an MOU and participant agreement when they issued their RFP. And you can learn a lot more, as Elisa already mentioned, in the published case study that the City of Melbourne has released.
Thanks, Mia. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Center Region Council of Governments. I will stop sharing my screen. I believe they're going to share.
Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Buck. I'm the chair of the Center Region Solar Power Purchase Agreement Working Group, and I'm joined by Jim Leos. Jim, you there?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. So we obviously, we have different kind of cosmic backgrounds here. Jim's in space and I'm hanging out with a bunch of ferns in the Shingletown Gap. Anyway, we're really pleased to be here with you today, and thank you very much, RMI, for putting this together. It's really exciting to be from, you know, a little place in central Pennsylvania with big ambitions. So we like to share these little quotations here. Henry Ford giving us a nice little boost on the one hand, and then Ben Franklin saying the same thing, but maybe with a little bit more of kind of cynical view. We don't want to hang together. We do want to stick together, and we want to succeed. So Jim and I are part of a multi-governmental group in Pennsylvania here that has brought together distinct municipal bodies, a school district, authorities, a county government, and a council of governments to work together. And we're focused in the south central part of Center County, which is in the middle of Pennsylvania. Just so you know, that that star there is where Penn State University is, and I work at Penn State. So we are also working through one of the most extreme COVID-19 case spikes in the country right now. As I said, we are 15 members. So we include a transit authority, a housing authority, 2 water authorities, a sewer authority, a refuse and recycling authority, 6 municipal governments, a school district, a county government, and then this council of governments that brings folks together. And we're enabled to do that through, to work together through Pennsylvania's Intergovernmental Cooperation Act. So different states have different enabling legislation. This is the piece of legislation that helps us work together. I worked on Penn State's solar power purchase agreement through my position at Penn State Sustainability Institute. And by doing that, working on what has ended up being a 70 megawatts of installed capacity, 150,000 panel, about 103 megawatt hours a year of electricity, which is now functioning in Franklin County, helps Penn State avoid 15% of its greenhouse gas emissions and accounts for about 25% of its total purchased electricity across its entire Commonwealth system of 23 campuses. This is Eric Barron, the president, signing one of the panels with Governor Tom Wolf there behind him. It is the largest solar project in Pennsylvania. And what I saw in working on that project were really incredible prices and the possibility of crafting an RFP with multiple positive outcomes for the community, for the environment, for education, for job creation, and so on. So in the fall of 2018, as I was part of that group, I started talking with Joe Vigilone, who is on the call today, the COG finance director, COG Council of Governments finance director, and said, hey, I think that the finance directors from around the region might be interested in how competitive the electricity price is for a PPA, a solar PPA in Pennsylvania, compared to the dirty grid. Because I can tell you, Penn State is a very risk-averse organization, and we, the university, I should be careful, I don't actually speak for the university, but Penn State saw estimated about $14 million of savings over a 25-year PPA. And I told that to some finance directors, and they went, let's see if we can get our folks together. So we did, through the Council of Governments, we were able to get the Public Services and Environment committees and the finance committees together with other stakeholders who have now signed on with us, and reached out and formed a group in June of 2019. Jim?
Yeah, so we formed that group, and then it was the consensus among the group that we should put out a wider net and see if anybody else was interested. And so we came up with the first draft of the agreement, and then we floated it out to some of the other areas, and we got it, we put a timeline, then we let the timeline slip a little bit, and then we got additional members. And one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit later is that one of the entities is this transit authority, which is a federally funded authority. So they brought some new procurement rules into the situation that we had to satisfy in order to make this agreement go forward. And the interesting thing that, as Peter said over here, and I think we saw in the previous presentation, is that COG was a trusted form. We already had this agreement for certain services that were procured and delivered on behalf of a group of municipal governments. And then I represent the school district, and the school district was very involved with them through the Parks and Recreation, through joint use of facilities and agreements on parking for facilities, and so it really came together. Peter brought it together and made the proposal, but it really came together when the school district got involved and some of the other municipalities and the county government got involved. And then, sort of a final landmark was there that our cost sharing agreement was approved. So I think we want the next slide, Peter.
Yeah. So what Jim set that up very nicely is that what happened is that we created what I think you could call a fair off-taker model, which is a blend of the three that you've presented. So in a way, the school district is the biggest off-taker. They use about 14.5 million kilowatt hours of electricity a year. They're in a way the anchor, and they've ended up being the fiduciary. Then, though, we have all these different entities, and so in some sense they have to be equal. And so we all vote, these 15 entities, but the school district gets 2 votes where everybody else gets 1. And there's a kind of tacit agreement that if the school district says, no, we're not doing that, it's not going to happen. Because if they pull out, there goes 14.5 of our 32 million kilowatt hours. So they really provide some heft there. Now, what we've also done here is we have these kind of different roles involved in that. The meeting logistics are handled that, mostly by COG staff, and Pam Adams and Joe Vigilone are here. CATA has brought the necessity of these following federal guidelines for some of the procurement issues. And then, Jim, you want to talk about the role of the district?
Yeah, and then because of the federal procurement, there had to be a lead organization to put all the billing through, put all the funding through. So the school district in particular, our director of operations, Randy Brown, stepped up and took on that role so that for the Center Area Transportation Authority, they could have a single fiduciary in that role, in the procurement role. So that's when we stepped up. But again, as Peter said, it's very much a consensus-driven organization.
But for any decision to be made, and this is the final point here on the relationship to the boards and councils, really for decisions to be made, everything that we decide within the group or recommend within the group ends up having to be approved by the 15 distinct entities. So that requires a lot of coordination. But so far, so good. We've already said, SCASB is the lead organization. Our cost sharing agreement is basically broken down by kilowatt hour. So the proportional costs that we will take on, each entity will take on as we go on to hire an energy services consultant, which we are looking to do in 2021. It's gotten put on hold because of COVID-19 and the staff time issues and reviewing RFPs, et cetera, that's going to have to be done. But we will share the costs for an energy services consultant based on the proportional amount of electricity used by any individual entity. So obviously the school district with 14.5 million kilowatt hours has roughly, I'll just say 45% of the total cost. The Water Authority is something like, I think 10 or so. CATA is comparable. Little Half Moon Township is, you know, a smidgen, an absolute smidgen. They'll end up paying a couple of $100 to go along for the ride. So there's some of that tiered work as well. Yeah, we are, anyway, we are excited, and our next steps will be, we hope to get an energy services consultant to work with our group. I would say that the things that really matter are that we keep our eye on the goal, right? We, as a group, we have some stated carbon goals among the municipalities, and certainly policy such as the school district's policy 833 that they passed earlier this summer that relates to climate and sustainability goals. We're very good about communicating. We talk a lot to make sure that everybody knows what page we're on, and the structure really matters a lot, and that we've created a structure that the whole group can agree to. So that those three different systems, we've engineered and figured out a version that is a hybrid of all three. Pam Adams is here with us. She didn't present, but she is on the call today. So if there are any questions, I think we would all be happy to answer them.